You're listening to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy. Today we'll discuss dyslexia, the brain, and reading science. One important takeaway to remember is that dyslexia is not one single thing. Let's learn more about dyslexia and reading science together.
Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy podcast. This is Lori here. And today I am very excited because our guest is an associate professor at the University of Maryland in College Park, which is our home state. So we are thrilled to talk with an expert here right in our backyard. Today, DJ Bolger is going to define dyslexia for us and share some brain science. So DJ, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm really glad you're here. I'm glad we're having this important conversation. I'm glad we are kicking off some dyslexia advocacy. And I'm wondering if we can start just by you sharing a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I've been at the University of Maryland for probably close to 14, 15 years now. My background is as a reading scientist. So I was trained at the University of Pittsburgh, where I got my PhD from the Learning Research and Development Center, studying with people like Chuck Perfetti and Isabel Beck on the science of reading, or how reading develops and how to teach reading. But I'm a neuroscientist as well. So a lot of that work has been looking at what does the brain do when we're reading and learning to read. But more importantly is what happens or what goes wrong when we fail to learn to read. And so a large bulk of my research and my work has been looking at reading failure. And this notion of dyslexia or disability is a key part of that, and understanding that. But also, we can look at environmental effects as well as, what we think are putatively biological effects and biological basis of reading disability. So I've been working, as I said, at the University of Maryland, where I do studies using MRI and EEG, as well as classroom-based studies. So I have a wide range of research topics, but all generally focusing on learning to read and learning in general, as well as factors in development that make that more difficult.
I'm wondering if we could just start by talking about dyslexia. Let's jump in. How is it defined? And is there anything that, like, right up front, you want people to know about it? What feels important?
So one of the things that I've been discussing lately is this idea of how we define dyslexia. And this has clearly been an ongoing discussion since the 1970s, that when dyslexia was kind of initially, I don't want to say discovered, it was initially diagnosed in terms of an inability to learn to read in the face of otherwise what would be normal expectations for learning. And as you and many of your listeners may be aware, that led to, well, how do we define the expectation of being able to learn to read? And that went to the use of IQ testing and things like that were kind of the primary determiner of what your propensity would be. And so that developed into what many people know as the discrepancy criterion for dyslexia, which is if your IQ scores or your general IQ or fluid IQ or different types of measurements of it are substantially discrepant from your reading ability, that would then qualify you as reading disabled or dyslexic.
That's interesting. Okay, I didn't know that. Thank you.
And that definition has obviously changed with IDEA in 2004, with a real movement to remove the discrepancy criterion and to replace it with a a look at factors early on and what we call the precursors, or that are often those are the things that we're looking at, these screeners, these reading screeners, or dyslexia screeners, as people call them. I don't like calling them dyslexia screeners. I could talk about that later, but
yeah, please.
but the idea that we really should be looking at who's at risk based on these early profiles in kindergarten, first grade, and then to be intervening early, and to look at disability or those who fail to respond to intervention, thus the RTI or MTSS approach, multi-tiered support system, that those who fail to respond, those are the ones who truly have a disability or a difficulty in learning in the face of repeated attempts and intensive attempts to teach them.
And when you say fail to respond or, have difficulty learning in the space of attempts to teach, how does that teaching look? Or what does that teaching look like? Because I'm sitting in a district here in Maryland that has readers and writers workshop and the phonics curriculum that goes with that, but we know that is completely misaligned to how they are supposed to. So I'm just picturing here that there's a lot of kids in the failure to respond category because they're not getting what they need in the first place. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate or kind of just react to what I just said.
Absolutely. So I think the notion of what should qualify as the intervention, or what interventions do you use, and how, and have the children gotten good core instruction, I think is another place where we talk about, right, that the first part of intervention is just strong core instruction. Mm-hmm. There have been a lot of these I would say graphics of, those children who will do fine no matter how you teach them, right? The top 30, 40%. And then those who, if you don't teach them to break the code in some explicit format, right, that they're the ones most likely to struggle. And then, at the kind of bottom of that distribution, the bottom 10%, they need something that's more intensive, that instruction needs to be, or intervention, should I say, needs to have a higher level of intensity. And we have to start looking at the factors of what is it that's holding them back? Why is it that they're failing? And I think that's a big part, of both the science moving forward, as well as, how we instruct teachers, or how we teach teachers about how to intervene. I know everybody, will criticize any kind of one size fits all, and as they should. It's called an individualized education plan for those identified with a disability for that reason. And one of the things that I focus on, especially in my research and my advocacy work, is really understanding dyslexia in a way that we get away from the notion that this is a single thing. Dyslexia is not a single thing. And I think the big core idea that I would want everybody to take away from this is that dyslexia is, in some ways, I often refer to it as bike riding disorder or bicycle riding disorder, which some people will then kind of scoff at and say, well, what do you mean? And how's that, and it sounds strange. And what I mean by that is that reading is a cultural convention. We weren't evolutionarily predisposed to read. Language might, there are arguments about, the biological and evolutionary basis of learning language, spoken language. But reading itself is a cultural invention that's only been around for, roughly 6,000 years. And so the idea that we should be able to read, some biological basis is something that's not, doesn't, from a neuroscience perspective, from a biological perspective, well, we're not expected to read. So like bike riding, we've created bikes and used bikes as a tool. Literacy is a tool. So then we have to understand that what would be the issue that would be preventing us from being able to do something that so many other people can do. And so when it seems like, 75, 85% of people seem to be able to read, some very easily, some with some more explicit instruction. But when we start to get into, well, why is it that some just completely struggle? We have to start to look at what are those components that the act of reading builds on. And that obviously has roots in language and phonology, but we also can start to look at other things like syntax, vocabulary. And then even at a lower level, a lot of my work focuses on things like attention, working memory. So those facets of our mental capacity that seem to preclude us from learning in a broad range of areas, not just in reading. And so what I really want people to understand is that reading disability or dyslexia really is a disability that has a multifaceted kind of background or source. And so you can come to have this disability through multiple either genetic pathways, if you will, biological pathways, or environmental pathways. And so I think that it's important to understand that all of these factors can play a role, oftentimes intertwining together, interdependently working together.
That is kind of novelty to me. I didn't ever think about it like that. I mean, I think I've thought about when we don't teach students how to read the way that we know is true and the way that research tells us that obviously leaves a big group of children not being able to read and almost presenting as dyslexic readers, if that's the right way to say that. Mm-hmm. But I didn't think about it as an environmental factor. Is that what you're saying? Like, is that one possible environmental factor?
And one of the things we have to think about with environmental factors is that environmental factors can become biological factors. So, for instance, we just published a research study about a year ago or so looking at what changes happen in the brain between 4 and 7 years old from effects of stress. And some of that, we looked at the effects of stress across the board on children and the stress reactivity. So we measure something called cortisol. That's our stress hormone. Mm-hmm. And we look at those who have had increased release of cortisol through that period of time and what happens in the brain as it's developing. And then moreover, what's happening to behavior. And what we see is that those who undergo lots of early life stress, they end up having changes in the brain in areas of prefrontal cortex. Many people will kind of understand that's that area that's involved in planning and attention and working memory. And that those areas seem to kind of undergo a type of development. We almost call it a rapid development, or they kind of reach peak early is the current thinking about it. But that ends up potentially putting us kind of a cap or stifling the development of prefrontal cortex, which then what we've shown and others have shown has an effect on working memory and attention. So you see what would look like greater attention deficit disorder or something along that line. So one of the things that I say is that even environment and issues in environment early in life can become embedded in our biology, such that when children get to school age or in that time where they're trying to learn to read, right, factors like attention, working memory may be problematic. But we also know that language is a huge factor, and early language. And so there's been lots of studies about the language development and different trajectories of children, and that oftentimes that language trajectory starts early in infancy, toddlerhood, and if not given a certain type of amount of input, there's a fairly decent amount of research to suggest that has consequences further on down the line. Hollis Scarborough, who's well known for her reading rope, but it was also her work that basically identified the primary precursors, the things that we identify in those screeners. It's her work that's identified, what should we be screening for in kindergarten, to predict, reading success or failure later on. And even research that she's still involved with is showing that a lot of the primary predictors of success or failure in learning to read in first, second, third grade, a lot of them are language, right? They're all early language.
Can you say more about that? Like what are the factors that contribute to either success or, I don't want to say failure, but or challenges?
So, and I think one of the things that we think about is you could take a number of things from vocabulary, right? Just the number of words and the types of words and the variety of words. So, and to look at the impact that would have. So even with something like phonological awareness, if you don't have in your mind, in your mental vocabulary, words like hat, bat, fat, sat, would you start to have an understanding of the rhyme of at, and that would go on to implicate a whole range of things that we think about in phonological awareness, from rhyming to individual phonemes. But then we could also add to that the syntax, right? The idea that, what do children learn in those first 4 years, right? How to add this s sound to make something plural, or add this t or d sound to make it past tense. And what we often don't understand is children are learning through what we call morphology, right? Those little added endings or prefixes, right? That they're really learning that just by plugging and playing with putting different pieces of sounds onto the word, we're changing it in a meaningful way. And that's essentially what we call the metalinguistic awareness. That is what phonemic awareness is. And people talk about morphological awareness in the educational space. And so what we are starting to really understand is that those types of factors that are acquired early in those fundamental years in infancy, toddlerhood, pre-K years, those factors are probably the primary things that are building those faculties that allow us to then see words as things that we can plug and play with. And to give you another analogy that I like to use when describing at least the word recognition process, is that I say kids need to see words as Legos. Right? They need to understand that, if I want to, I can take this little piece and I can put this little piece on top and now it's a car. Or I can, what if I take this little piece and put these two pieces here and there? I can make it into this or that. And so reading as, especially reading in an alphabetic system, as we do in English language, right, when we go to put these letters on, right, they're mapping onto these sounds, these phonemes, in a way that we're plugging and playing with them like Legos. And so if children don't understand and see that these things are just like Legos, I mean, I think if there's anything I would have a teacher or a parent or anything understand, is that words are like Legos, right? Yeah. You can plug and play and put the different things on the beginning and end, and it changes them in a way. And that's why, we always used to use examples like the name game, Bobby Bobby Bo Bobby Nam Na Na Bo Bobby, right?
All those fun songs, yeah.
Right, as a key of phonemic awareness or phonological awareness. But what is it teaching the child? It's teaching the child that these words that they have in mind, they can play with them. They can take off a sound, they could add a sound, right? And those are the core ideas of phonemic awareness. And what is it that idea of phonemic awareness is basically telling them, is that, these letters, when we, start to put on these letters, is that they're just doing the same thing in a visual format. Yeah. So if there's anything that I really would, in the science of reading, that I'd want to get teachers to understand, is just understand that concept, and that'll just drive your knowledge in a way that I think would fundamentally get you to think differently about the process.
Yeah, I like that. That's really fun. And it's like a kind of freeing way to think about it. Just play with words, play with sounds, play with letters.
When a lot of the detractors from things like the science of reading, the common refrain from balanced literacy or whole language has been, oh, it's kill and drill. And, what I often talk about is I call that the poverty of imagination. It's that things can be fun, and just playing with words is fun, right? And I think that's, if you can do things that make that knowledge and awareness fun, it's not kill and drill. It's teaching children that their language that they're using is an amazing thing. It's something that they can play with. And if you look at artists and singers, songwriters, poets, right? I mean, what do? They're playing with words. They're playing with sounds. Dr. Seuss, some
Rappy,
rap. Well, no, I was going to say even rap artists are some of the
greatest. You're going to say rap artists. I was saying Raffy. I was still on the pre-K train. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, but even just the amazing grasp of language that they have, of words, of rhyme scheme, of sound. I actually, I would probably say that they probably have a greater awareness than the average person. But my point there being is that it doesn't have to be kill and drill, right? There's a lot of things that are exciting, engaging, culturally relevant, culturally, that. So I think a lot of the aspects of this part of the science that get a bad name of being kill and drill and those types of things, I think that there's, like I said, it's a poverty of imagination in which we just have to rethink how we play with language, how we do that in our instruction and intervention.
Yeah, I love that. I'm wondering about taking this back to students who either may have dyslexia, who may present as having dyslexia. As you said, it's a lot of different pieces. It's not just one. And thank you for framing that for us so that we can have that important takeaway. But what happens, do you mind sharing what happens in their brain if I'm trying to play with words, right? I'm a student who either is presenting as, and I like to say that because I think a lot of kids do kind of have the same qualities, but aren't coded officially. And I think it's important to know that there's a lot of children out there who are struggling, who may not be, officially given the IEP or officially have that diagnoses. So I'm wondering either a student who presents or who has been, coded as dyslexic, what happens in my brain as I'm trying to play with words like you just described, or play with letters or play with sounds?
And as I said before, you can have kind of a multitude of different profiles of children who come to, they get to this point and they struggle. And sometimes, as I said, they can look different. Now, there are particular profiles that tend to be more dominant than others. And I also, will point out that there obviously is family inheritance. So family history of dyslexia is a large predictor. And there are genes that are documented to be involved in some cases, but not all. And in many cases, you might find, kind of one of the most prevalent genes seems to be really indicative, but it only counts for 17% of those with dyslexia. So,
Oh, wow.
Many people that have it, might end up having dyslexia, but it only accounts for 17% of the dyslexic population. So what I would say is that those with dyslexia, what it tends to look like in the brain tends to look traditionally, ever since the 1990s, early 2000s, we've seen lots of brain images that show this area of the brain that is in the kind of back. It's kind of associated with our auditory receptive language processing. that this area has been less active than those who are able to read. So that's been the kind of primary finding, through the early 2000s. But what I would say is that since then, as I've said, is how do you get to that point? Is it that part of the brain was just never active, or is it that certain things that have failed to happen in development, or certain things that are happening genetically are preventing those areas from developing? I think that's what the big question has been from the neuroscience and side. What I would say is that a lot of the evidence shows that it's that connections, the areas that are connected to those regions of the brain, especially those in the genetic profile. Nadine Gabb up in Harvard Medical or Harvard School of Education, she's done a lot of great work looking at these children with a family history of dyslexia and showing that particular brain areas, particular connections in the brain are the wiring is faulty in some ways. And actually, this goes back to the work of Galiberta and others in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So this is actually rooted in work when they would unfortunately do post-mortem. They'd look at the brains of those who have passed away and say, oh, this person was dyslexic. And so they could start to see, oh, yeah, this is they had faulty connections between these brain areas. But we can see it, as Nadine's work shows, early in development at 3, 4, 5 years old. But even in the case of her studies, not all of those children go on to develop dyslexia. So some of those children with a family history, they do go on to develop normally, and those who do, those areas tend to strengthen. And it seems like those that don't, those areas, that connective tissue doesn't strengthen. So
is there any correlation between the areas that did strengthen that they were taught with structured literacy?
So we there have been lots of intervention studies that have shown that, yes, in fact, with intervention, many of the of those areas do come back online. I think that's something that's been documented, since the early 2000s, and repeatedly we see over and over again these effects that you get more brain activity, and from these interventions, most of them are these well-documented processes of phonics-based approaches, strong, explicit letter sound instruction. The connectivity, there have been a number of studies that have looked at that connectivity. And I think one of the things that we take away from that is this idea of that multimodal, right? We talk about that you have to have vision and sound working together, but also motor working together. I think that there's a lot of those things, that these connections that are, going back and forth, right? They're connecting, sight with sound and sound with meaning. And so, as well as sound with our hearing with our motor processes of speaking. And so these different connections, they're being strengthened because of the multimodal, nature of reading and being able to put these things together. So that's why I think we see that interventions that definitely focus on, having a strong letter sound component with even adding the motor, drawing the letters and those types of things.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. Like, it would look like the student saying the sound of the letter while they're correctly writing the letter or tracing the letter, or using like multiple modalities to help them essentially rewire their brain and get it in their body, right?
Exactly. And even to bring up the idea of phonemic awareness, one of the discussions that's been kind of carried out into the popular, I would say the popular press, I guess I should say social media, is this idea of...
I think that's also another way to say it. I like that. I'm going to start saying it. The popular press. It's much fancier than saying social media.
Social media. And these discussions of how do we best do phonemic awareness and how long, and many of us, who've been in the sciences, the reading sciences, have known that phonemic awareness has a particular trajectory, but it actually really develops and takes off as you start to learn the alphabetic principles. So as you start to get those letters and put them together with sounds, and it goes back to the Lego analogy that I made, which is infants, they learn words and they learn phonemes early, but they're not necessarily aware of them, right? That's the difference between the kind of acquisition of language process versus the awareness of language. The awareness of these things that we can plug and play with them really comes from using something that's a different modality. Is that, once, I see that this t sound is represented by this T, or this, this K sound is, this K sound is represented by this K. And that's the first letter. And there was a thing of my daughter, Kylie, she used to see Kmart and say, "That's my store." And it's that notion of that first sound, that sound has a representation other than that auditory, that really gets you to kind of consolidate the idea I can really play with these things.
Yeah.
So that's why, but I think that's also why particular intervention approaches for phonemic awareness, like clapping and tapping and stomping, are effective, is because they're getting you to use a different modality to break apart or play with, as I said, I'll use the Lego analogy, to see that these things can be broken apart and put back together in different ways. And so those connections from the visual input, the letters, the sound, the motor input, whether it's tapping or drawing, those are really allowing you to have a strong representation and a strong awareness of this sound, and that, well, what is that sound associated with? Well, this little squiggly line that I just drew.
So I know we're a little over time, but I'm wondering if you could answer one more question, and then we could wrap up. When a teacher is teaching and they're using structured literacy, and they have a tier 1 curriculum, they have an intervention, everything is aligned to science of reading. Like, I'm thinking best case scenario here, right? For a teacher to have the tools that they need. What would we see in a student who struggles? Like, I'm just picturing a teacher in the classroom and hearing you say all of these incredible tactics, right? Playing with letters, playing with sounds, words, morphology, vocabulary, syntax, sentences, using a variety of modalities to teach. I have, my tier 1 structured literacy curriculum, and still I have a student in my class who's really, really struggling. What would I see in that student who's struggling? Because I know that he's struggling or she's struggling, but I feel like that was not taught in college, to me at least. Like, what would I see in it? What does it mean to have a student who struggles? And then I think the next question probably is, and what can we do about it? And I think that question might be more limited depending on where you are. So I'm hoping that you might be able to dive into those two finisher questions.
And I think the question of what we often refer to as non-responders, those who don't respond as well to intervention, or don't maybe respond as well as we hope. I think one of the things to look at is the accomplishments, or what has the child accomplished and learned. And I think I want to break this down into two different ideas.
Okay.
One is the idea that the child is making gains personally, but when it comes to standardized testing, we don't see it. And that, in fact, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Massachusetts, this is where I got my kind of beginning and love of doing this work. I was working in a laboratory that we were doing dyslexia remediation and seeing great impacts. And one of the issues that we still would see is that oftentimes on some of the measures and things that we'd see, a child would make what we'd say a 3 or 4 standard deviation gain over the course of several months. except when you look at them on a particular standardized test, they're still in the first percentile.
Mm-hmm.
What happened is they went from 7 standard deviations back to 3 standard deviations back, which is a huge gain in kind of where they came from. But it's still, when they're measured against their peers at the same age, right, they're still in the first percentile. So it doesn't look like they've made any gains. So,
that's so important to remember. That's so important to remember.
And I want to really emphasize the fact that it's important to look at the gains that the individual child's made in their learning, not just for your checkmark books, but for them. Because the other part that I'll add here is the motivational piece. And I had actually really come to this through the brain, because originally when I was trained, I was like, oh, motivation's whatever. But then when I started really getting into the brain science and seeing how much motivation and dopamine, the flow of dopamine from the system, really is the energizing force for making this work, I was like, oh, I guess motivation is important. And one of the things that we know about motivation is that competence leads to confidence, right? So as opposed to the other way around, right? A lot of people, well, if you tell them they're doing great, they'll feel good about themselves. Well, actually, the better thing is that if they see some kind of competence, that confidence that they start to gain is rooted in them seeing the line grow. And so one of the things that, even going back to my time doing interventions, in Massachusetts, was that child seeing their accuracy lines increase. We'd give them word lists of word families, cat, bat, hat, fat, sat. And as they got faster and faster going through those lists, they could see their times drop. That motivational boost was huge. Even for these kids that might still be at that first percentile for reading, that was the boost to keep them going. And so even for these kids that are quote unquote non-responders, there's one thing I would say is look at the gains that they are making. Look for what are those gains that they're making. Might you still have children at, in 5th grade reading at a 1st and 2nd grade level? Yes. And that still is heartbreaking. But one of the things that, if that child went from being able to do no decoding at all to basically being able to do most of their decoding, and right, they can now start to, move from trying to get faster and faster, build that fluency, or at least get to, make sense of the words. That's a far better place to be than saying, okay, well, now you have to rely on read tos for the rest of your academic career.
Sure.
And so I think that's the key of the non-responders, is to really look at where are they making gains, because it's likely that they're making gains. It just sometimes is not always easy to see. And if they're not responding, sometimes, looking at different approaches that you might take. Where are their weaknesses, and are there different approaches that we can take?
I love what you said about focusing on the individual student and look at their individual gains, because especially with our students who are, having challenges with reading, we don't necessarily do that so often. We mostly compare them to like a grade level standard, or, what they're expected to do at this time. But I think it's really important to remember that when our students are struggling, the most important thing we can do is to show growth in their specific journey, and also show them the growth. Like you said, the competence leads to confidence. That resonates a whole lot. I love that. I'm going to make a poster.
One of the things that I tell my student teachers as I'm teaching my pre-service teachers is when you think of every struggle that you're coming in front of, every hurdle that you face, or every mountain that you're looking at climbing and it's daunting, what is it that you draw upon? And right, you start to think back of, well, have I been able to do something like this before, right? And I think that sense of when a child can see that they've made gains, and they know they struggled, but they made, you make it abundantly clear, look, you did it, you've done this, right? Look at what you've done already. That gives them at least the confidence to approach, you worked hard, you did this, that gives them the confidence to approach the next hurdle, the next hill.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who are, at that struggling end and those who seem not to be responding, oftentimes that path and that journey might be slower. It's just a lot slower to meet each of those hurdles. And each of those hurdles might have to be, you can't jump from 2 feet to 4 feet. You might have to, move from 2 feet to 2.5 feet, to 3 feet, right? And you might have to take that journey slower.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that reminder. That's really, really important. I have one last question, and this is just a question for you. Why do you do what you love for education or for literacy? And I will let you think about that for a moment and then jump in.
I think for me, the love of literacy and studying, what happens, I think stems from two things. One is just wanting to, make a difference, of wanting to see children and also those who are vulnerable, right? The ones who are most likely to fail are those who are the most vulnerable in our country. And so one is making a difference for those who are most vulnerable, and understanding that those who don't learn to read are going to continue to be the most vulnerable, right? The highest incarceration, the less, more likely to have addiction and other types of problems and just difficulties in life. And so I think that just that liberating sense of being literate and being able to read is completely liberating. And so for me, it started with ensuring that all children can read. And I think the second part is that sense of just really understanding how it all works. The scientist in me really just loves to understand how I can understand how this works. How is this going together? What's happening in the brain and what's happening in the minds and the psychology of these children. And so to be able to put those two things together, right, to put that scientific knowledge and curiosity and need to understand and know together with the sense of being able to then help to make children literate and to reach all children and to have them maximize their outcomes. I think that's really what has driven me to this point.
Very noble. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I know I said we were going to have a short conversation and it turned into a 43-minute conversation, but I'm so grateful that you are here and that you gave us so much of your time and that we could really dive deeper into dyslexia with an expert such as yourself. So thank you.
Great. I'm glad I could do it. Glad to be here.
Thanks for listening, literacy lovers. We release a new podcast episode every Friday and share more resources in a newsletter on Tuesday. Sign up for our newsletter at literacypodcast.com. Each week, you'll receive important information, resources, and connected content.
We're excited to create a space for community discussion about our podcast. We want to connect with our listeners and support you in answering your questions. But we also realize there are a lot of other educators out there who have great advice and experience too. Let's keep learning together in our Melissa and Lori Love Literacy podcast Facebook group, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter.
If the content in this episode helped you, share with a fellow educator and teacher friend. Our literacy lover community welcomes educators at every stage of their learning journey. We're so glad you're here to learn with us.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests of the Melissa and Lori Love Literacy podcast in this episode are not necessarily the opinions of Great Minds PBC or its employees.